Hello and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. My name is James, your host. I started this podcast to help other folks share their own healing stories and to interview thought leaders and experts in the carnivore, keto, and low oxalate space. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to Equip Foods and the Carnivore Bar. As an affiliate, you can use the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products when you check out using the code Carnivorist. Thanks in advance for listening, subscribing, and any likes or shares. And now, on with the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. It's James, your host. I am super excited about today's episode because I have back a returning guest and one that was so impactful for me. That is Monique Attinger, the low ox coach. Monique, welcome back to Carnivorist Chats.
Thanks, James. Glad to be here.
I am super excited to have you back, Monique, and the listeners will understand in a second. We are going to do a listener-submitted Q&A episode. I just want to say thank you again for your first episode that we did together because it is the episode that I have gotten the most feedback on. And again, it's because of the way you present things, how approachable you are to this oxalate issue, and how thorough you are in your research on what oxalates can do to us. So thanks so much for that.
Oh, I really appreciate the feedback and just can't wait to be even more helpful.
Wonderful. Monique, let me just give the listeners a synopsis of what we covered in the very first episode, and I'll direct them back and I'll put the link to our first episode in the show notes so we can dive right into the questions that were submitted because I know we got a few and they're important ones. So in that first episode, Monique and I, which was episode 35 for those that don't know, I'll put the link in the show notes as I suggested. We got into how Monique first got into oxalates, her journey into finding out about oxalates. We talked about what oxalates are and how they can be harmful to your health. We talked about also what foods are high in oxalate, and we talked about Monique's Dirty Dozen list, which was one of my favorite parts of the conversation, by the way. So good, really good. We got into what symptoms are synonymous with oxalate toxicity and sort of mast cell activation syndrome, arthritis, and more. We also talked about how to properly navigate lowering your oxalate intake, especially if you're going into the carnivore diet. And we'll touch, I know, a little bit more on that today, Monique, and thank you in advance for that. And then we got into what supplements can assist you as you come off a high oxalate diet as well. But for the listeners, please go back and for reference prior to this one, if you haven't heard it, please listen to that episode. This will tie in so beautifully to what we discussed in that first episode. So what I did was I reached back out to Monique when I had all this feedback and questions coming in from listeners that were, as I suspected, going, that sounds just like me. I have all these issues. Can you please ask Monique this and that? So I said, Monique, I've got to get you back on. We've got to do a Q&A. And here we are. So we had the listeners submit questions, and I'm just going to hand it over to you. I know you've organized them in such a way that it's going to be really helpful for them.
Well, I'm hoping by grouping them, we've got kind of bigger topics that we can tackle, but that the questions will be answered in a context then. So it's not just standalone. So we actually have a number of questions here, which are, I would argue, about oxalate mobilization or dumping. We also have a couple of questions here, which are regarding that histamine aspect, where oxalate can be involved. And then we've got a couple of lone wolves that we can handle on their own. But we've got a lot here that has to do with dumping. So I'm going to read the questions that I grouped that way, and then we can talk through it. So our first one, do you find the symptoms from oxalate get weaker as time goes by, or do you find they can come on stronger but less often? Number two, do you think it is better to ride the oxalate symptoms out when you get a bad attack, or stop the dumping process with something like tea or chocolate as examples? Definitely want to talk about that. What would you say are the most common oxalate symptoms? I'll handle this from the standpoint of dumping because we did talk about symptoms before, but let's talk about what it looks like if dumping is the trigger. When first going low carb or carnivore, is it true you may not experience any symptoms for months or even years? We'll handle that. And approximately how long on a low oxalate diet until dumping symptoms are not as severe and frequent? So I'll talk about general patterns then. Your mileage may vary, as they say. Okay, so oxalate dumping. So this is a term that was developed or posited by Susan Owens, who was one of the first ones who looked at this and said oxalate can be just mobilized into the bloodstream kind of in a, we'll say, predictable way, but you can get these waves of oxalate that can really trigger things off. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about oxalate dumping. Now, the symptoms of dumping are generally the kinds of things that helped you identify an oxalate problem in the first place. So, what you might find is, let's say you're one of these people who has oxalate stored in the joints. So, when you go through a dumping episode, your joints may flare for no apparent reason. That's the kind of thing, you haven't done anything to exacerbate it. You didn't overuse the joint, blah, 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 but it hurts. That can be an oxalate symptom with dumping. The other thing that can happen, this one's more specific to dumping in particular, but if you're starting to mobilize oxalate, it can often be stored at the site of a previous injury as well. So if you've had surgeries, if you've had falls, if you've had other kinds of injuries, you sprained an ankle or something, and all of a sudden out of the blue, that ankle's hurting, I would be very suspicious that's related to oxalate. So we definitely have things that are more likely to be triggered by dumping as well. So we'll get into the histamine aspect of this for our next part of the questions. But certainly some people will get runny nose, itchy eyes, things that look like seasonal allergies. And it's interesting because oxalate can actually be moved out via the mucous membranes. And you have those in here. You have that stuff going on in the lungs. So you have multiple ways where oxalate can be secreted. So that is a bit of a challenge in terms of what kinds of symptoms will you actually get, because it will depend on where you've had it stored and how your body is secreting it out, because oxalate is removed by secretion. So it's not the kind of thing where it can passively diffuse. Your body's doing some active work to get rid of it. And that's related to the fact that all of us produce a certain amount of oxalate. That's natural from our metabolism. And so our body understands that it's an end product and we have to get rid of it, and it uses secretion to do that. That's really why kidney pain can be downstream, because kidneys do a lot of the work, probably the lion's share for most of us. Gut pain can be typical because we can actually secrete oxalate back into the gut for disposal. And interestingly enough, there's research on intestinal stones, which are, you guessed it, calcium oxalate. So we can have these interesting ways that we're getting rid of it that are based on secretion. The lungs, as I mentioned, but you can actually have oxalate moving out through the skin. So while that one's not got the kind of research that I'd like to see, there hasn't been that kind of curiosity about it, unless somebody's got primary hyperoxaluria, whole other ballgame. But for those of us who just have more oxalate in our system, potentially because of our diet, I have actually had clients send me pictures where they show me little crystals, and that stuff's been moving out through their skin. So symptoms are going to be related to where and how we're getting rid of it. That's going to be normally based on secretion, but we can be tripping off symptoms basically any place we've been injured, any place we can secrete to or from. And so you can really have systemic things going on, which makes it very complicated to give people sort of more specific idea. But if you've listened to stories of people who are dealing with oxalate and you hear the kinds of patterns, inflammatory symptoms are common, histamine type symptoms are common, rashes, pain, and for sure, kidneys, digestive tract is ground zero. So those kinds of things are probably more common in terms of symptoms. That said, here's some good news about dumping, because that sounds really miserable, and who would actually want to do this? So some of this is kind of mindset. So there was a point in time where my own dumping symptoms were so miserable, and for me, insomnia was a big one, and that is true for a lot of people as well. So I remember going downstairs from our bedroom putting myself on the couch, watching reruns of old comedies from the 60s and 70s and think better out than in, better out than in. Like sometimes you just have to ride a wave because dumping can be very intense. But the good news is that for most people, you have the highest intensity of symptoms, say in the first 6 to 12 months, depending upon how much oxalate might be on board. And then the intensity of these waves starts to come down a bit. So your peaks are not as high. So you might start with peaks that kind of, roll you over. But then over time, you're getting bigger breaks generally between episodes of dumping, and the peaks are not as high. So it's not like you're going to feel those really more extreme kinds of symptoms forever. It's part of the process as you're getting rid of, let's say, the most accessible and potentially biggest stores of oxalate to begin with. And that is really going to depend on how long you've been on a high oxalate diet or how compromised your metabolism is.
I would just like to add, Monique, and thank you for that. That's amazing. I think I shared in the last episode my own personal experience so the listeners have some context from me. I definitely noticed the old injury site. I have had chronic from exercising days, rhomboid pain prior. I injured my shoulders severely when I was in college. And this is now, I always have this severe pain in both of my rhomboids, especially the right one, when I know an oxalate dump is coming. And then it is a precursor to kidney pain, and then lower back pain, and then definitely cloudy urine. And then my stool is also affected about 2 days later. But all that is precipitated by the sleeping aspect. You hit the nail on the head, the lack of sleep. I always know when a dump is coming on, when I have those waking episodes or I'm in the middle of the night. And again, one of our user questions is about that. What I really want to ask really quickly, Monique, before we jump in back to the dumping symptoms is that histamine connection, because from listening to you, I understand that the body releases histamine at some point during the early hours of the morning to wake you up about 4 a.m. So is that all intertwined with your oxalate dump sometimes? If the mast cells are being activated by a dump going on during the night and releasing the histamine, which will wake you up?
Yeah, I'm very suspicious of that. As we talked about, I think a little bit last time, sleep pattern, histamine high to be wakeful, histamine low to sleep. It's got to stay down for you to stay asleep, and then it's got to come back up for you to wake up. So yeah, that 4 o'clock in the morning when we typically think, oh, the body's releasing cortisol to wake us up. Well, the brain's releasing histamine to wake us up. Now, if oxalate has been irritating the mast cells, it's possible that they're producing a little bit too much histamine, but not enough to sort of totally mess us up. So maybe we're dropping down to here instead of here as a visual. So this is fine. Maybe we're able to stay asleep there as long as the mast cells don't get punched during the night and release some histamine. And then all of a sudden we are wide awake. And I don't mean sort of awake. I mean, I myself experienced my heart rate would be up. It was like adrenaline had been released, right? Wide awake. And a lot of other people have that as well. Or they may not be able to settle down for any length of time, so they may keep popping up. Like I know people who will wake up every 45 minutes when histamine's too high. So unfortunately, oxalate, because it acts as an irritant, because it sets off the inflammasome, mast cells are going to pay attention because the inflammasome's been activated. That's their job. Inflammation is like the mast cells' raison d'etre, right? They're supposed to pay attention to that because they're the guards at the gate. They're the ones who set up the alarm, right? Histamine's a signaling molecule. And so, yeah, the mast cells become irritated. They become more likely to release histamine. And when they do, it's really downstream potentially for some of us of oxalate. It is not an independent histamine issue. So I think a lot of people get a little confused there, and maybe we're going to hopefully help with some of that. Although initially when you lower oxalate, do you know if oxalate or histamine's a bad guy? No. You have to almost assume both of them all the time. at a later point in the process, you may be able to see, oh, look, I did something that triggered histamine, but oxalate's not moving. Great. Or, oh, look, oxalate's moving, but I don't have all my histamine symptoms. But, most of the time, you're dealing with both of them.
Thank you. And one comparison I'll also make is our dear friend Jeannie, the low ox grandma. She, when her and I first chatted, she talked about her experience, and I'm now 2+ years into my lower oxalate diet, a year and a half closer to 2 years of being mostly carnivore. And that proverbial oasis, when you get through the dumping symptoms, as time goes on, the distance between the oases gets shorter, as you're rightly saying. I've noticed that myself, and they're not quite as intense as, oh boy, those early first ones. So definitely apt description, Monique. Thank you. And I'm sorry I took us off a little bit of track, but it's still to do with the dumping symptoms and things like that.
Absolutely. We're still in line. And the one thing I will say is that dumping is also going to be more intense the more rapidly you dropped oxalate. So whether the oxalate's coming from something like supplementary vitamin C, got a client right now who started on 10,000 grams of vitamin C when she started with me. We haven't even touched her diet yet. We're still pulling that down, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's come from supplementary vitamin C, it's coming from the foods straight ahead in your diet, or it's coming from your metabolism, which may be producing more oxalate than somebody else's, which can also happen. That's endogenous production, which is on here. When your oxalate starts to drop, the more extremely it dropped, the more likely you're going to get more significant dumping, because what you've done then is the gradient between the oxalate that may be in the tissues and what's in the bloodstream starts to be very different. The more different it is, the more likely the tissues are going to say, I've got this oxalate here, I'm going to dump it out into the bloodstream. And the bigger the dump, the more likely we have more significant symptoms.
Gotcha. Really makes sense.
Yeah.
With that being said, I think the next one where you mentioned is, do you think it's better to ride out the symptoms that you're getting, or to stop it right dead in its tracks with some chocolate, for example, which happens to be a high oxalate, and we covered that in the last episode, and tea as well, which we also covered.
This is a bit of a judgment call, truth be told. Now, if you're having really extreme oxalate related symptoms and you've nosedived in your oxalate intake, like those of us who've gone carnivore, who've gone straight from, oh, I was mostly plant-based, to, oh, I'm a carnivore and now my oxalate intake's essentially zero, right? If you've done that, and I won't name names, but if you've done that,
folks, don't do what I did. It's me she's talking about. I did it.
Then it may be a worthy thing to say, okay, I'm going to hit with a certain amount of oxalate, dietary oxalate, where then I'm going to have oxalate coming into the bloodstream, and I'm going to moderate these tissues who are going, woohoo, bloodstream's clear. I'm going to throw as much out as I can. And if there's more oxalate in the bloodstream, then the tissues will essentially get some pushback and that's not really a good description of what's happening from a biochemistry standpoint. But what we can do with taking in some higher oxalate is kind of cut the tops off these peaks of oxalate dumping. And so I have used chocolate to stop a dump. What I would say is the more likely that you have histamine issues, then you should probably go to a low histamine but high oxalate food to try and push back and slow things down, moderate it by getting some dietary oxalate in. So maybe something like sweet potato would be a better choice than something like chocolate. But if you handle chocolate okay, it is a way to get a concentrated dose of oxalate and not too much food. So if you're also not looking to have to consume a lot in order to get the oxalate in, because some of us, our guts may be off, there may be a bunch of things going on. So chocolate can be a good option, especially if it's dark chocolate, because that is really high. There are other options you could probably look at. Not my favorite, because I'm constitutionally averse to them now, but chia seeds, which are really, really high. Oh yeah.
Oh
anyway.
no, I'm not going there. I can't do it.
No,
I have nightmares. Flashbacks, Monique, flashbacks.
Yeah. and spinach, of course. But, I think what you want is something that you tolerate well, but is going to give you a reasonable amount of oxalate punch, if you want to call it that, so that you're kind of taking the top off this big spike that's going to happen. And would you want to ride it out? What I would say is ride it out if it's manageable. If it is not manageable, you are not doing yourself or anybody else any good. As a dear friend of mine her husband would say to her when she let a dumping episode get out of control, he would say to her, "I'm going to beat you with the broom you rode in on." Like, don't make yourself and potentially everybody around you feel awful. More than anything, I once had such a severe dumping episode, I ended up in ER. And in my case, really high blood pressure spike. I walked in there 230 over 130. That is not funny. And that was in the middle of the night. I hadn't been doing anything. So what you want is to have your symptoms be manageable. I mean, it may not be glamorous, but you should be able to at least get through your day. You should not have to walk into ER. You should, be able to kind of deal with life. So when in doubt, moderate those symptoms. I don't see a benefit to not doing that.
Before I preface this last question on the dumping side, Monique, I want to just say that my own experience with this question, and it is when first going low carb or carnivore, is that you may not experience any symptoms for months or even years down the road, as the listeners will have heard from our last discussion, that was my case. As I went more carnivore and lowered my oxalate load for the first 3 months, I felt like a superhuman again. I was like, my goodness, I've got my life back. I'm going to do it. And then that 3rd month, boom. But I've also heard you say, and I'll let you get right into it now because you know far more than me on this subject, is that it really depends on your past dietary tail and the state that you're in at the time that you begin, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And the thing there is, part of the reason why you may get this wonderful honeymoon period, and most of us have had some kind of honeymoon, like could be 2 days, could be 2 months, like, with you where you had 3 months. But the reason that we get that is that our body's not perhaps quite ready to dump yet, but this oxalate influx has stopped. And you're right, it's a taste of where you can be once you're done the healing process, right? So I have to remind people, don't assume that the diet's not working because you start to feel bad, because that oxalate was toxic when it went in, even if you didn't notice it. And you're really going to notice it on the way out because you're in a completely different health status than you were potentially when it went in, right? But you have to sort of hang on to the fact that if I lowered oxalate, that's the lever I pulled. That's the only lever I pulled. And I felt that much better. Then oxalate's clearly part of this picture. And now the job is get the stuff out. And unfortunately, in my own case, I ate probably a high oxalate diet for most of my life. But the oxalate that went in when I was in my 20s, I was in a completely different health status than the oxalate that was going in when I was in my 40s. And I was in my 40s when it was coming out. And that is a whole different ballgame, right? So the fact that you tolerated it for so long means that your body had enough resilience, maybe you had enough balance in your health account, so to speak, that you handled it okay as it went in. But you're not the same age, the same place, whatever, when it's coming out. Because most of us have discovered that we are feeling less and less well. And that's when we figure out oxalate. And that's when we're trying to get rid of it. So back to that business about riding out a bad attack, you need to conserve whatever resilience you have and do it smart, because there's no award for doing it faster than anybody else. And it's got a chance to disrupt things as it's moving. So you really want that to be as manageable as we can make it, right? And that feeds into the last one, approximately how long on a low ox diet until dumping symptoms are not as severe and frequent. So for most of us, if you don't have a big health diagnosis, like I've had clients who had, an arthritis diagnosis, or they were being checked for things like MS or like big diagnoses. If you don't have anything like that coming down the pipe, I think probably most of us will be able to, I'm going to say, depend on our baseline energy level by the time you get to somewhere in 12 to 18 months. So in that time period, I was able to start scheduling things and feeling confident that I would be able to come to the plate for the scheduled event, whatever that was, right? It's certainly more marathon than sprint, as you know as well. And I don't want that to be incredibly intimidating to people, because the thing is, you're feeling better in between dumping episodes all the way along. And in fact, even when I was first dumping and dealing with the bad insomnia and things like that, I was like, I could tell that something was happening. My digestion was improving. There were things where things were getting better. I don't think most people see absolutely no improvements even while they're going through dumping. I think if you're paying attention, you're seeing things that are getting better. Like I had started before going low oxalate, where I had to take like handfuls of digestive enzymes to be able to get my food down. And I was only weeks in to oxalate when I was like, wow, I have to rev this back. I have to rev this back. I have to rev this back. And I was digesting my food on my own. Did I have other things going on? Yes, I did. And you start to see patterns, so that, like you were describing, you can see when dumping's coming along. And for most of us, there will be some kind of pattern where we know, oh yes, that's telling me that the next dump is coming down the pipe. But over time, those get shorter and shorter. The time periods between get longer and longer.
As we get into this next section, which has to do with histamine, I again have to thank you so much, because you've been such an advocate in this area. And since doing our last episode, I've found that most of the folks that reached out are dealing with not only oxalate, but also histamine issues. I think it's a huge thing, as you probably know now, for your client base. And just for the listeners, just a little top level thing. We already discussed a little bit about histamine, but so many folks think it's a bad thing in the body. It's actually not. Histamine is part of the body's function. We need to have a histamine response. However, it's the oxalate and the interplay between oxalate and histamine that causes the disruption. What are some of the symptoms and high histamine foods that are, I know you have a couple of ones that are out there to look out for?
For those of us who are in the carnivore area, the biggest thing that is a potential histamine hiccup for us would be meat that is aged, or any animal product which is not really fresh. So the main thing that happens with animal products is, as they are aging, they're not going bad, but histamine is developing. And so I think of it as like a histamine clock. So the clock starts ticking. And when you get food which is fresher, when when the animal was slaughtered, all those kinds of details. I actually buy from a small butcher, so I know this stuff. Then a lot of things that you might not otherwise be able to handle would be okay. So unaged beef, no problem. I actually even eat bacon because I know the time period with this particular small butcher, and everything's happening really quickly. And even though it's smoked, I do have no problem. So there's things that you can do with freshness that really give you an advantage. But the challenge here is really what I was talking about, that oxalate irritates the mast cells give off histamine, and that's where we end up with this. I'm going to say we're running slightly too high with histamine. It's almost like the immune system's a little too hypervigilant, or the idle on the engine's turned up a bit too high. It's a little bit like that. And the challenge there is that we are using histamine for good things. Histamine for wakefulness is good. I don't like to have to fall asleep in the middle of the day because I'm exhausted, right? And when you digest food from the first bite, your gut is starting to release histamine. So histamine is part of the digestive process. Again, it's not a bad thing. But when our overall histamine level might be hovering a bit too high, when you get the spike for a meal, or you get a spike because the mast cells are being triggered, then that's where you get these disruptions to the cycles that would otherwise be benign and as they should be. So breaking the waking every hour cycle, this is so hard because, the challenge really is it takes time. And when we're sleep deprived, we want that to be fixed now, right? So one of the things that I've tried is, for myself personally, I find the more I manage mindset, meditation, vagus nerve, all those things are really helpful. If your immune system's hovering up here because there's too much histamine, so everybody's just a little too awake, right? Then the only thing that can come up and over that you have control over is the nervous system, and that can bring everybody down. So I am vigilant about daily meditation, daily vagus nerve things, and they don't have to be expensive and they can be really easy. But some of that will start to slowly help with bad sleep cycle. Taking things that help improve the quality of the sleep. If your sleep cycle's messed up like that, if you can get better quality sleep, even during segmented sleep, that can be helpful. And theanine is an amino acid, very good for helping calm focus in the brain and very good for quality of sleep. So I will do something like that if I'm having problems. Magnesium before sleep can be really helpful because you just want the body to be as calm as possible. If like this question is really talking about back pain, but pain can actually be a histamine phenomena as well. So, being able to help support the body with anti-inflammatory supplements can be really good. So one of the things that we do to break down histamine is we build an enzyme called histamine N-methyltransferase. And this needs a methyl group in order to be made by the body. And so I'm a little suspicious that supplements like MSM that have a really good reputation as being anti-inflammatory, part of the reason is that methyl group in there that MSM can donate, and perhaps we're breaking down some of that histamine. But, one of the challenges there is really being patient enough to sort of work with yourself, do things like meditation, because that's no instant fix. Do things like vagus nerve stuff. Again, no instant fix. But I have seen some really great results from cold showers. Not my favorite thing, but I'll take a regular shower. I'll finish the shower for half a minute on cold. I've now gotten to the point where I laugh at myself while I'm doing it. And, I've picked out some songs to sing that I actually timed to see how long, so I could tell approximately how long I was doing it, because it's so easy to tell yourself, oh yeah, that was 15 seconds.
Oh,
yeah.
It sure is.
Right. Anything you can do that facilitates that handoff from sympathetic to parasympathetic is really important here, because if we're hanging out in our sympathetic nervous system, that's also going to help keep that histamine high, because the body is primed to react, and histamine's a signaling molecule. And so we have to kind of keep that in mind. When it comes to healing the histamine intolerance, that can be this business that's related to oxalate, like a complete healing is going to take time, but will you get potentially breaks in oxalate dumping where you might see your histamine symptoms settle right down? Yes. But I'm gonna harp on a point. Like, you have to be vigilant about your stress. You have to be vigilant about these things that I'm talking about, because mindset helps set the idle for your histamine production. And so we just have to do it. Like, there are so many people who say to me, well, can't I just take a supplement? And are there things that can help? Sure. But, they're not silver bullets in any way, shape, or form. Like the theanine. Theanine can help. Is it a silver bullet? No. Melatonin can help. Is it a silver bullet? No. And actually, interestingly enough, I have found that chamomile tea really helps. I listen to the Huberman podcast, and he talks about a sleep stack where he uses essentially an extract from chamomile as part of his sleep stack. And I just drink the tea because it's easy. So that's another one where it can help with some of the issues that have to do with your sleep cycle being messed up by histamine. And then the other histamine thing, supplementation with beef kidney. This is a really good one because DAO helps to break down histamine in the gut. And so if part of what's setting us up with too much histamine in the body and then potentially in the brain is that we're hovering too high with histamine, then we produce histamine or we have histamine in our food and then we're absorbing it out of the gut. And yeah. So can we reduce our histamine load? And we can by taking something like DAO. If you want to take like beef kidney, I've had clients who were from backgrounds where they were willing to eat fresh beef kidney. Great way to get DAO. A supplement that is kind of dehydrated kidney that could have histamine plus DAO. So you'd really have to see how susceptible you are to the histamine that's in the food. Not everybody is as vulnerable there. So I don't know what the difference is, but I see people who can handle histamine in plants, can't handle histamine in meat. And I see the opposite, can handle histamine in meat, can't handle histamine in plants. Some of this is unfortunately trial and error, but there are also DAO supplements which are essentially just the enzyme. And so if you have a histamine problem, you might be better off with one of those. They are nosebleed expensive, which is unfortunate, but I know people who have ongoing histamine problems where they still haven't managed to get the whole system revved down. And if they take a couple of these DAO enzymes with a meal, they do quite well. And I also know people who can use it as a rescue protocol. So they're going to go out, they might do something silly, and then they take maybe 5 or 6 of these DAO, and that helps them ride it through. Personally, I do sometimes use antihistamines as a rescue protocol. I don't use it much anymore, but when my symptoms were really bad, again, I don't see any benefit to totally overstressing your system. So there have been times where I took a protocol that was published by Lawrence Afrin. He's an MD in the US. He's got this huge book called Never Bet Against Occam. And that book, he walks through over 30 patient profiles. And he almost universally would put them on regular Claritin, but 2 doses a day, and regular Pepsid AC, but 2 doses a day. And Claritin is an H1 antihistamine, deals with the receptors that are normally associated with seasonal allergies. And so if your nose runs, your eyes water, blah, 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 that's what Claritin's after. And Pepsid AC is what they call an H2 antihistamine, and it deals with histamine receptors in the gut. And if you start to cover over those receptors, it can give you a bit of a break from symptoms. And so I would never advocate this without speaking to your doctor, but because it's a published protocol in this book that Lawrence Afrin has written, I'll suggest sometimes to people that they could read that about that protocol and then make a call on it, discussed with their, practitioner or their pharmacist to make sure that there's no contraindication for that. But I found myself that was very helpful. And sometimes what I did at night, if I needed to sleep, is I would swap out the Claritin for Benadryl, because Benadryl makes you drowsy. Why does Benadryl make you drowsy? It penetrates the blood-brain barrier, which means it helps with that histamine issue in the brain. So again, all it's doing is covering receptors. It's not a get out of jail free card. It's not getting rid of the histamine, but it's at least giving you a break from the symptoms. Now, Benadryl's got issues. There's been research on it, relating it to Alzheimer's and other things. So again, not something I would tell anybody to do on a regular basis. But there were times when I was so sleep deprived, I just needed a few hours. And so I did all the things I talked about. I talked to my pharmacist, I talked to my doctor, I made sure nothing was contraindicated, and then I did it. And, if it's going to make you capable of handling the next day, say the next day is a big day and you've got stressful stuff you're going to have to handle, big day at work or whatever, and you just need to sleep. I think we need to be able to help ourselves in those moments.
I'm just going to interject to give you a chance to catch your breath here on my own experience. And it just speaks exactly to what you were saying. Folks, when I first found out I was oxalate toxic and began to lower my oxalate load, I was reacting to so many foods. I didn't think I could eat anything. I would get the histamine response right away. My tongue would get swollen. I'd get nasally. I couldn't breathe. My ears were clogged. My brain was foggy. And I have to tell you, I had read about diamine oxidase, which is the DAO that Monique was referencing. And I decided when I first began to introduce animal foods, I actually included beef kidney, fresh kidney that I got from my butcher. And I found it helpful. And I'm not an affiliate. I have no association with him, but I also use Dr. Paul Saladino's company for a supplemental form that he has a product called Histamine and Immune, which has beef kidney in it. I use that as well. Very helpful. But prior to even finding out about oxalates, I was actually engaging in a program by a lady by the name of Annie Hopper. And she does a program called Dynamic Neural Retraining System. And that speaks to what Monique was saying earlier on and the meditation. It basically is retraining your brain in a way that you don't react to scents, to foods. And I, again, found that so helpful. The last question, Monique, on the supplementation side, before we move on to the big one, the one that I'm excited about, the endogenous production side, is from my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that, and again, spoke to what you were doing, I just needed sleep. I was not sleeping at all. I hardly slept for 2 years. I maybe an hour or two a night because I was constantly waking up, constantly in pain. So I used theanine, L-theanine. I used chamomile supplementation, and I did use magnesium. Now, I'm getting approached a lot, as I'm sure you are, on the concern, what specific type of magnesium do you recommend? And the concern with glycinate and the glycine pathway going down, will that convert over into oxalate eventually in the body? Is there any issue with using the glycinate, which is supposed to help with sleep?
Here's what I'd say. Can glycine be metabolized into oxalate? Yes, it can. It's most likely to happen if you are deficient in B6. So having good quality sources of B6, including potentially supplements, is a good idea. However, you want to start B6 slowly because it is one of the ones which is a bit of a double-edged sword. It can trigger dumping as well as be supportive. So you want to start with tiny doses and only move up very carefully. But that can help with not pushing that glycine down the wrong pathway where it ends up as oxalate. That said, it's not an all or nothing. We get lots of glycine in our diet. And so if somebody's taking, 500 or 1,000 milligrams of a magnesium glycinate, they are getting less than a gram of glycine total. And yeah, to my mind, that's not necessarily a level at which you have to be really concerned. I remember seeing glycine used as a sweetener where you're taking 8 grams of it at a time. Yeah, then I would be concerned, right? So it's not an all or nothing. But the other thing people could do, if they're a little bit worried about what if I'm one of these people who's going to push glycine in that direction, then maybe take some as glycine and take some as magnesium threonate or magnesium taurate. Those are also forms which are calming, helpful, and may work for you just as well as the glycinate. So if you are concerned, don't stress yourself, go to another form, but maybe take some glycinate, some of one of these other forms, or completely go to another form. If you're having histamine problems, some people don't handle citrate well. Now, I handle citrate fine. If I take magnesium citrate, it's not an issue. I do it all the time. But for some people, it can be a trigger. So if you are dealing with histamine, I would move to a form where I'm not dealing with that. And the other thing that we found really helpful for sleep here, which was really interesting, were pH balancing kinds of forms. Now, I'm not one of those people on the alkaline bandwagon where I think you have to eat an alkaline diet or somehow you're going to become acidic. I think that underestimates how the body is able to handle these things. But that said, I took a combination supplement that had carbonate and bicarbonate forms of minerals in it. And I found that really calming, and that might be related to the bicarbonate as well. So there's multiple ways you can go here, but as a basic to help with sleep, I think minerals are huge.
For sure. And I still take it to this day, Monique. I still take a magnesium glycinate in the evening, but I just factor it into the potential amount of oxalates that I'm consuming in my diet to stop the dumping process and to keep some oxalate low levels in my diet basically now. So I agree completely. Well said. And I had forgotten about the 3-in-8. The 3-in-8 specifically helps with your brain and calming down your brain, as I understand it, which is a great one. This next one, I'm gonna tee you up here for this one because I'm excited, as you heard me say, is the endogenous production of oxalates in the body. I was really amazed when I realized that not only are we consuming oxalates, but the body is also making them. And some of the oxalate deniers online say, well, oxalate's got to be fine for you. The body's making it by itself. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you do not understand that you are going way over what the body can handle if you're eating a high oxalate diet. So please tell us about the question that says, please explain endogenous oxalate production and how to manage it. This is a big one.
So yeah, we do all produce some oxalate. That is a given. But what we're producing metabolically in I'm going to say, normal kind of range would be 30 milligrams of oxalate or less. So very easy for your body to handle that much oxalate. That's even lower than what most organizations recommend for someone who has kidney stones to consume of oxalate in a day. So we're talking a very small amount is normal to be produced from the human metabolic processes. So the issue is not really producing it, it's how much we're producing. And like you said, whether or not we're exceeding our body's tolerance levels for it. And I kind of look at it like this, that even if the kidneys can handle 10 times that amount of oxalate, which, very often our organs can handle a lot more than normal amounts of something, because nature tends to over-engineer, and that supports survivability, right? So let's just play a little bit. Let's assume you could handle 300 milligrams of oxalate a day. I don't think I'd want to consume that much, but okay, let's just assume. A single spinach smoothie is already blasting past that level. And, the kidneys have to do the lion's share of the work. And oxalate is inflammatory. And I just don't understand from that standpoint alone why people would think that oxalate is a no-brainer in terms of that. But the other problem with oxalate, and especially endogenous oxalate, is that it is going to act in multiple ways in the body. It's a mineral chelator. So then all of a sudden your minerals are under pressure, and maybe you don't have enough of them for important work like magnesium that's used to produce energy in your body as well. So we don't want too much oxalate. We particularly don't want the kind of oxalate that is produced out of our metabolism, because it's the anion form. And that means it's being produced without a mineral attached to it. And so it is going to, for sure, if it runs into any appropriate dance partners, it's going to bind to them and leave with that. So magnesium, calcium, zinc, iron, just a host of things that oxalate as just a mineral chelator is going to impact. So the fact that we produce it endogenously is not a reason to think it's not problematic for us, because we have lots of end products of metabolism that the liver has to detox, that the kidneys have to get rid of. Oxalate's not the only one. And so the idea that we produce it, so it must be okay, would be like saying, well, you produce urine, you produce stool, you produce these other things. We want to get rid of it, right? It's not like it's going, oh, I can use that oxalate molecule over here in this process. No, your kidneys are going, okay, come here. I got to get rid of you. It's just, we're not, the idea that somehow it's benign because the body produces it is just it's a bit naive, I would say. So endogenous oxalate production is something everybody does. The problem is when your endogenous oxalate production goes up, right? And that's most likely to happen when the body's under stress, when we're depleted our B6. B6 is used particularly in the mitochondria, but many places in our biochemistry. And if we don't have enough B6, that can be one of those places where we start to push things like glycine down the wrong pathway and end up with more oxalate. So B6 is a big ticket item here in terms of endogenous oxalate production. And different kinds of stressors like inflammation, depletion of nutrients, all the kinds of oxidative stresses could be things that start to make us produce more oxalate because of the impact on the body and how the body copes with not having certain kinds of nutrients available, like B6. And I don't think we eat B6 rich diets in general, particularly if people are more plant-based. You're just not getting perhaps enough for like extraordinary situations when there's more stress on the body, when there's more demand for it, right? You may do fine if you're not got a lot of stress and your body doesn't, but I would argue over time with a plant-based diet, you're going to kind of be insufficient, if not outright deficient. And that's going to get you in the longer run because the body can do all kinds of fancy footwork to deal with not having enough of a nutrient, but only up to a point, and then things are going to happen. And that's where I think endogenous oxalate production comes in. So if you've started to produce too much oxalate out of the metabolism, the main thing here is starting to unwind that problem with potentially extra levels of the nutrients that are most likely to have been depleted and therefore not available. And that's why you started down this road to producing oxalate in the first place. So I usually call them the Three Musketeers, which is, me being a little bit funny, but these are ones where you're very likely to have some kind of issue that could be affecting your endogenous production. One is biotin, and that's because oxalate directly disrupts the function of biotin in our bodies. And so we can be low in it. And when we start it, we can trigger dumping, which is pretty typical with these big guns. B1 is another one. And people like Elliot Overton and my friend Chandler Mars and Derek Lonsdale, who all publish on Hormones Matters. I have oxalate articles there too, by the way. But the B1 can be a big ticket item here too, because if we're not producing enough energy out of our body, it is a process that requires energy. Secretion requires energy. We have to have enough energy to move that oxalate out. And so that kind of stressor can also be something that may have contributed to us ending up producing oxalate again, because we didn't have enough of something and we started to push something down the wrong pathway. And then B6. B6 is like the biggest gun of the Three Musketeers. So those ones are usually going to be ones that we're going to need. And you may have kind of a daisy chain situation to get to those. So I often start people with D-ribose and then B2, because B2 actually helps to get B6 into the cells. And then I do B6. And, there's things like that where we have to kind of build a foundation and then add the big gun. So you come in slowly and gently, and that's really how you kind of get at endogenous production. And the biggest thing there is you don't want to swing the metabolism too fast, too hard, because we need to respect your resilience. We need to respect the body's capacity. We need to start slowly building the foundation before we add a nutrient that's going to pull on the biochemistry. And then the next one is going to pull on the biochemistry. You have to have the groundwork done first. So with things like B1, you can need to have ALA on board first. And you probably need to start with biotin because B1 also leans into the biotin biochemistry. So you have this progression that we need to do in order to deal with endogenous production. But for sure, nutrients there are like going to be much more important. And the diet alone is probably not going to get you there.
Super interesting, Monique. And that is going to be like everything today. And again, I get so excited listening to you and talking with you. I just, again, Christmas morning thing. It's just incredible the interworkings of the human body and how you have to be so careful. And I have as well, I'm hoping to get Elliot on the podcast at some point. I've reached out to him and he's a big fan of Dr. Longsdale's works, especially with thiamine.
Yep.
That just, I just one question for you on that is that, you know, he's a big proponent of high dose B1 thiamine therapy. I assume then from your experience, you do, as you were saying, have to be careful depending on the person's status. Rather than going full bore into high dose thiamine, you might have to get other things on board or just be very careful because it could trigger dumping for those oxalate toxic folks, right?
Well, it could trigger dumping, and you also might not have enough of the cofactors you need for B1. So yeah, I think there's a process to get there. I've certainly seen some of my clients do really well with higher dose biotin, or not biotin, B1 intake, but having biotin there, having ALA there, having other cofactors there, and then bring the B1 on. That seems to be a really good approach because, again, we just respect that the body needs to have these things in place in order to make use of this B1. And if we don't, then all of a sudden, like, what if you've got all this B1, but you don't have anything it needs to be able to do its functions? Then, you're throwing nutrient at the body, but it's not going to be able to make use of it as you want it to. So I think there's so much more we can learn in this area. God love me, I don't have enough time in the day to learn all the stuff I want to learn, and I'm so fascinated with. I mean, part of the reason I want to talk about some of these things with folks like you is to get the word out, but also because I'm endlessly fascinated here. There are so many things here where we can do such a better job by our own health if we just, do some of these slow and steady things and go, okay, it took me, in my case, I was 48 when I found the diet. Took me more than 20 years to get in the mess I was in. If it was going to take me a couple years to crawl my way out, that was less than a tenth of the amount of time it took me to get there. Right. And in my case, 48 when I found the diet, 62, staring down at 63 now. And
I still don't believe you. I don't believe you. You look, you're not 62. I'm telling you. Anyway.
Well, and my 17-year-old's friends don't believe her either. She says, my mom's older than all your parents. And they're all like, she can't be. Anyway, they think she's telling stories. But that's the payoff. Like, I just want people to know that's the payoff. Now, was I better instantly? No. But between 48 and 53, when I took up karate and had never done it in my life before, we had orders of magnitude change, right? So you may not see things day over day. You may not see things week over week, but you should be seeing things month over month. And it's all about being in for the long haul, right? And, I kind of want to wrap up with this because I think this is a really important piece. But what I want to say is the mental game is the game, right? Playing with our diet, anybody can do that. Changing things, anybody can do that. But you have to be able to hang in there, right? And that's where it makes the difference, is over that longer haul. Like, my kids had a tired mother who was on the road to several diagnoses. And I didn't think I'd live to see them grow up. And now the 22-year-old is going to get married soon. And the 17-year-old is finishing up high school. And I'm all in. I know I've got lots of time left, but I didn't know that at the time when I started this diet. And I think you have to be like bloodhound persistent, like you or bulldog persistent, like just don't let go of this thing, because it's possible. I mean, I don't say lightly that I didn't think I'd live to see my kids grow up, because that was one of the most unhappy thoughts I'd ever had. But my thyroid was bad, my adrenals were bad, my digestion was bad, I couldn't sleep at night, I had high blood pressure. I was well on my way to all kinds of problems. It doesn't have to be that way, but you might have to deal with your emotional attachment to certain foods. My husband could tell stories about me feeling sorry for myself because I was going to have to give something else up. Yeah, you have to, like, as a friend of mine would say, the obstacle is the way. You have to deal with the thing that's in front of you, do the hard work, but boy, the payoff is good.
And again, I am a walking testimony for this exact scenario too, Monique. There were days where I prayed because the pain was too much and I was just suffering so badly. I just said, Lord, if you see fit, please help me heal, and I'll help get the message out there. And this is exactly why I started this podcast, and exactly why I'm so grateful for folks like you. Monique Attinger, every time I chat to you, I learn so much, and I know the listeners will too. Thank you for all your expertise and guidance in this area. What an honor. It's such an honor to have you back. And just so the listeners know, I want to do this again, and Monique's agreed to do another one in the near future, but she's on a well-deserved rest for the next little while. And if we didn't get to your question today, please know that we will get to it the next time, whenever that's going to be. Monique.
Oh yeah, very good point.
Yeah.
Because there was one here that I would like to get back to, but let's do, a bigger discussion about what endogenous means. Maybe I can put together some even some slides and stuff, because some of this we want to maybe wrestle with what's going on a little bit more, like under the hood.
Monique, I know you had talked to me prior, and you had said that perhaps there were some coaching opportunities or some classes or courses that you had coming up. Are you still doing that, or is that on pause right now? So you let the listeners know.
Well, I would really like to do some group coaching. I had really planned to do group coaching over August and have just been kind of on a sprint to get through July. And now I'm sort of at the cusp of being on holidays. So I think what I'll do is do it in September. So my plan right now is to do group coaching that will deal with this more complicated scenario that people get into, where it's oxalate, it's histamine, it's salicylate, and they've got this complex dietary thing going on, and where supplements are really going to be a bigger deal. So I'd really like to help people who it may not be in their budget to do one-on-one coaching with people, and I understand that. And it also, they have this big thing on their plate, right? This really more complicated situation. So yeah, that's my plan at this point, is to make that available in September. And like, I really love when people bring their questions to something like that. It always makes the course a little bit different. This is a way for me to get more people able to tackle what's going on for them. And so, yeah, that's my plan right now, is start in September.
Going to be so helpful for so many folks, as will this episode today. Monique, I know you led folks before in our last episode, but please remind them where they can find you online.
Oh gosh, too many places. You can find me on Twitter, whatever they're going to call it now, as Low-Ox Coach 1. You can find me on Instagram, Low-Ox Coach. You can find me on Facebook. I am Monique Attinger nutritionist. And I have a Low-Ox Coach page there. I'm probably more active on the Trying Low Oxalates Facebook group for people who are more interested in like participating in a support group. I that's my volunteer work. I help with that group and with answering questions there. And then I have my own YouTube channel at Low-Ox Coach, and I'll probably have excerpts from this lovely interview over there. And I also participate with a group of professionals. We call ourselves the Wizards of Ox. And we are having fun with this. And it's great because we have 4 people. We have Susan Owens, who started the original Trying Low Oxalates group. We have myself. We have Carla Wiersma, who newly has her PhD in nutrition and will also be taking clients. And we have Patricia de la Garza, who comes to this from the direction of behavioral therapy. And actually, Carla and Patricia both had children who had autism diagnoses, and both of them have children who are now working, doing things, like really amazing healing through lowering oxalate and kind of handling the supplements. And I, of course, have raised a couple of kids who actually needed to be on a low oxalate diet too, who didn't have those kinds of diagnoses. But my son, who had asthma, doesn't, as long as he doesn't cheat. And my daughter, who was developing like symptoms of vulvodynia and interstitial cystitis at the tender age of like 2.5, is a healthy young woman of 17 now. So we have the four of us, and between us, we have over 70 years of experience with oxalate. And so it's really fun because we all come at it from a slightly different perspective. So we kind of have this roundtable Zoom session where people can get a chance to attend if they're interested. If they join the Triangle Oxalates group, they'll be able to get the link. But we post all those videos up to our channel. And so there's lots of information there. Now, they're long form videos. They're all about an hour, but it's another place where you can find me if you're looking.
Last thing, Monique, if and when you do this coaching program in September, should folks go to your website to find it, or where would they go?
My website's a great option. So lowoxcoach.com. And I will undoubtedly announce on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as well. So we will be getting the word out. And it is my plan to really do that in the fall. I just, I love the kind of energy that you get with a group coaching where people can really help each other in the learning process as well, because you share stories and so on. So yeah, I will definitely be doing that. And I'm looking at probably Wednesdays, but the details on the dates and stuff will be later in August.
Monique Attinger, it is always an honor and a pleasure to chat with you. And I want to thank you again for taking the time out and just being a voice in this space that is, like I said, full of knowledge and willing to share. We thank you, and thank you for coming on and chatting again with me.
Thanks again, James. It's been great as usual.
Thank you. It's awesome. Thanks, Monique. And that's a wrap on this episode of Carnivorist Chats. If you've made it this far, I want to say thank you for listening, and also thank you in advance for liking, subscribing, or sharing this episode. Thanks again to the good folks at Carnivore Bar and Equip Foods. Don't forget to check the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products. And also, don't forget you can book me for a 30-minute carnivore coaching session. Again, the link will be in the show notes. Until the next time, be well.